Hi, okay, so we're back. We're looking at a philosophy of evil with a Norwegian philosopher, Lars Svendsen, who is alive today. He was born in 1970. He teaches at the University of Bergen in Norway. He's written a philosophy of fashion and also a philosophy of boredom. Today we're looking at the foreword and the introduction of his book, A Philosophy of Evil, which was written originally in Norwegian in 2001 and was translated in 2010, translated into English. So one thing that we have to get clear is that he's thinking of this way of considering evil as something to be less as entertainment and less as sensationalistic into something that gets us to focus on everyday life and how we are all capable of evil, which is something to recognize and not to avoid. And so to get us away from this idea of thinking that everyday evil is something that is something to pull away from, and rather he wants to get us to focus on it. So in other words, this idea of thinking of evil as sensationalistic gets us away from thinking of evil as a moral category. So his thinking is that our turning of evil into something that is aesthetic is getting us away from the banality of evil in everyday life. So perhaps we lose sight of the horror of evil when we just focus on the extreme examples, such as the wars in the former Yugoslavia in the early 90s, or perhaps the terrorists of 9/11 who were characterized as evil by world leaders at the time. So there are obvious examples in which Svendsen wants to avoid in the name of focusing on ordinary and everyday evil. So in other words, he wants us to focus on the everyday practical side of evil as opposed to the sensational examples that we find in the news or in entertainment. So the monsters and the sadists, the genocides examples, the genocides, etc. These examples push us into the extreme to emphasize evil at a distance. So this distancing of evil is not as good as when we start to recognize evil as something that we are all capable of. So we never want to recognize ourselves as evil. It's always them in the extreme examples. So we never want to see ourselves, ordinary individuals, as capable of evil. So Svendsen is wanting to see this capability of evil as less other than we think. So as more everyday, more ordinary, less sensationalistic. Of course, we'll never understand evil as completely intelligible, yet it might change from basically fascinating to something that is enormously sad, as Svendsen puts it. So Svendsen and I can't cover the full breadth of the way that we understand evil. So he's basically letting us know that we're not going to do that. So he offers us 4 explanations concerning the so-called origins of evil. So those are on pages 13 through 14. So the first definition is that people are possessed or seduced by a malevolent or supernatural power. 2, people are predisposed by nature to act in a certain way that might be described as evil. 3, people are influenced by their environment to commit evil acts. 4, people have free will to choose and act in accordance with evil. So he's going to be working through these definitions in the book, and we're going to just touch on a few of them as we introduce the topic right now. Okay, so of these four, Svendsen avoids number one. Number one, again, is people are possessed or seduced by a malevolent supernatural power, and that's how we usually understand evil, as simply beyond rational debate, which is still a common viewpoint for how we understand evil. So in other words, we usually think of evil as someone, he or she is taken over by an evil force, etc. So it's Svendsen's view that evil is essentially human. So a human endeavor, a human interaction, right? As William Blake writes, cruelty has a human heart. Okay, so in other words, this study is not to get at the root of evil, but to see it as a human interaction, according to Svendsen. Okay, so, and I agree with him. So oftentimes it might look easier to do evil rather than good. So in other words, evil is a practice. It is rarely understood as something whereby people are taken over by some demonic force, but it has to do with this way that we are interacting with each other. And then so when we look at the introduction, we could ask ourselves, what is evil and how do we understand it? Or can we? So Svendsen cites the author Andrew de Blanco, who wrote The Death of Satan, that there's a gap between an experience of evil and our ability to understand it. So we have no idea where evil resides. So in other words, the French postmodernist Jean Baudrillard sees evil as residing everywhere. We are always watching reports of war, genocide, famine, violence, absent-minded killing. So in other words, evil, it becomes decentralized. The omnipresence of evil is made possible for Baudrillard because we don't know how to talk about it. So in other words, we push ourselves away from thinking about evil, but yet at the same time, it's omnipresent because we are pushing it out of our lives to the degree that it becomes something that is always something that is other, but yet we at the same time witness it, but yet we still have great difficulty in putting words to it, I think is what Svendsen and Baudrillard are pointing out. So then for Svendsen, he proposes that turning evil into a myth or a mythic symbol only oversimplifies and distances us from understanding evil. So Svendsen doesn't deny that there are evil people as there are good people. In fact, he suggests that a combo of good and evil capacities reside in us all. Yet he is reluctant to see that people act in a purely evil basis. More typically, those who bring about evil are often wishing to eradicate evil in the name of the good. So this is an important point. In other words, let's repeat that in other words, he's reluctant to see that people act as on a purely evil basis. So that goes back to that idea that somehow people are possessed by evil or that they're intending harm when they set out to do evil. So in other words, that's a way that we typically understand it, but we need to be taken out of that view to start recognizing this idea that usually people that are enacting evil are doing so in the name of the good, okay? That in other words, great evil is brought about by people who want to do or wish to do good. okay, to eradicate evil, okay? So in other words, Svendsen is also rightfully hesitant to equate evil with pure biology. So this is a point that we'll talk about later in the class. So we might think of such a parallel that makes the common mistake of confusing is with ought and morality with science, determinism with free will. Okay, so we want to avoid that mistake of thinking of natural catastrophes, etc., as evil in their own right. He's thinking of evil more as a human interaction. So this has to do with the difference between what is descriptive and what is normative, right? So biology in and of itself is not moral, is his point, and I agree with that. So we'll talk about that in a different class having to do with the is-ought problem, okay? But I think he's right. So a question of individual responsibility should not be dislodged from free will, the free will of the individual and the free choice of each person as a way to characterize evil as ultimately having to do with free will. So he writes, without free will, moral evil simply doesn't exist. So we rarely stop to draw this conclusion. The intricate relation with freedom and evil is something that is really important and that Svendsen is drawing our attention to. We only usually consider freedom in a positive sense. What am I free to do? I should be allowed my freedom, but never I should be free to choose evil. Yet evil is something that is intricately connected to freedom of choice, and free will. So it is for this reason that absolute freedom is impossible. Morally, we should be constrained from doing anything we want. To be sure on this, we must distinguish natural disasters and other such natural phenomena as the equivalent to evil, and we are free to withdraw from evil as it's characterized both by action and inaction. So in other words, this again is something whereby we have the free choice to either decide on how we're going to act and what the consequences of those actions are that could be potentially thought of as evil. So in other words, the freedom to act or to not to act has evil implications, right? So we want evil to be reduced to the unconditioned to get an answer as to what is evil, but yet it is constrained to specific conditions that whereby it becomes recognizable. So in other words, in the last paragraph on page 25, Svendsen writes that good and evil are relative concepts, but let's be super careful here not to characterize evil as relative in and of itself. What he's basically pointing out is that what he means is that good and evil are not understood as pure states or pure unconditioned states, rather that each good and evil are relatively understood within the specific situations which they are manifested, okay? So, quote, something is only good and evil in relation or relative to something else. But he's not saying that all morality or all evil is relative. What he's pointing out is that evil is understood within the context and is relative to a situation, but not that all evil is relative, okay? So there's a sense that Svendsen considers evil to be something that is suffered by humanity, even though pinpointing it is extremely difficult. Yet he disagrees that evil has meaning behind it, and that by this, I think he means that it lacks a reason or an aim, i.e. that evil cannot have meaning because it cannot be justified. So in other words, he's thinking that thinking of evil as having a meaning somehow will justify it, and he's avoiding that. And what he's also saying is that there's no such thing as evil in and of itself, that evil always must be understood within the context of human interaction specifically, and that specificity is how we'll recognize what evil is, not just as an abstract category. Okay, so to that end, evil fascinates us due to its increasing incomprehensibility and its essential mystery. So there are ways of thinking about evil whereby we see it as an essential mystery, and that's what's important, okay? So then, I'm trying to see the time here. It's kind of hard to see it. So in other words, evil fascinates us due to its incomprehensibility, its essential mystery, and so the incomprehending quality of evil exposes a lack, always beyond our grasp, something always to not be understood. Svendsen writes, quote, "Yet evil is an unavoidable aspect of the world," unquote. So even in its unavoidability, evil in all its instances is still easily lost in abstraction, okay? It's elusive, it's pre-philosophical. Still, Svendsen recognizes the phenomenology of evil found in experience, namely practical experience. So evil is not primarily a theoretical problem, rather a practical problem found in the practice of Svendsen's argument that evil is to the individual experience of all of us as having a practical focus in the everyday. So evil has no telos, or no universal aim in and of itself. So evil is manifested in the individual and all of us, okay? So always remembering that individuals act in a social network that is not easily extracted into the abstract ultimate cause as the so-called root of all evil. The point to be made is an important one regarding the interplay of the individual along with individuals acting together to enact good by way of dehumanizing the other as less than worthy of moral treatment. In other words, the evil person doesn't enact evil in the name of doing evil, rather to do so in the name of doing away with evil. So the evil of the other, the foreigner, the scapegoat, the blameworthy is something to be done away with, and doing away with such evil often in and of itself brings about evil, is his point. Okay, so we have the examples of the Belgian Congo, whereby the extermination of the Congolese had to do with economic control. And on the other hand, we have the Holocaust in all its horrendous evil is not the only worst example we have. So there's plenty others. So in other words, trying to pinpoint what evil is elusive, yet we see it as something whereby you're increasing the suffering of others in the name of eradicating evil. So there's that great paradox, right? So in other words, we could think of other examples and other genocides, right? The genocides in the former Yugoslavia, and those in Rwanda, et cetera, et cetera. So in other words, in this sense, evil is identified as targeted aggression toward a group of people, causing generalized suffering, and this often is easily identifiable. In other words, we might identify groups of other people as evil in the sense that they represent something that we want to have eradicated. So, in other words, this is thought of in terms of ethnic groups or political groups, ideological groups of people can be identified as embodying the evil that needs to be done away with in the name of the good, right? So, in other words, a salient point Svendsen emphasizes again goes back to the oversight we have to equate evil with a demon that is exacting malevolence just for the hell of it and for the pleasure of it. So this is a common way we understand evil, and what we're wanting to do is see the more subtlety. Rather, this metaphor, this mythology misses the specificity of all of us. So always recall to yourself, and this is crucial, that the worst evils enacted on our fellow humans is to see the otherness as a reason to act inhumanely toward them, again, often in the name of good. So is in itself a good lesson to draw from Svendsen. So I think that this takes us to the end of the introduction and a good point to draw the lecture to a close. And so we'll talk about it a little more in depth in class. So thank you.